Good day everybody. What I'm going to do today is show you how to convert DAZ textures over to Poser. First question is, why would you want to do that? Well, this is just a tiny percentage of the textures available on DAZ, 38 pages of textures. And if I showed you the same for Superfly materials on Poser, I believe there are 2 items for sale. So all of these wonderful textures, leathers, materials, woods, architectural stuff, metal, tiles, all of this stuff is available to you to use in Poser. And you don't have to have DAZ to install it, but it's a lot easier if you do. Now there are 2 types of textures, 3 kind of, but there's tileable textures, which are textures that repeat, such as, well, tiles, material, or seamless textures such as metal, where it repeats but you can't even see the repeat. And then there's, what would you call it? Textures designed for specific characters or props or sets, you know. So you could have a texture designed for this hair, and it uses UV mapping so that the texture at this end is completely different to the texture at this end. Or imagine a robot, for example, and you want wear and tear on the edge of the robot and clean textures at the front, and so it's different from part to part. So we're not interested in those textures. They probably can be converted, but they're only as useful as the original character that you apply them to. What we're just going to do today is look at converting over tileable textures, and we're going to be looking at PBR or iRay physically based render textures. So if I have a look, we're going to be converting 3 products today, from easy to difficult. So easy, earth tones shaders; intermediate, leather shaders; and harder or more complicated, they're not really much harder, but there's more going on, embossed metal. We may not get time to do them all because I don't want this to drag on for hours and hours. However, the first thing that I like to have is DAZ Studio loaded, and the same with Poser here. So these are the default states. These are going to be for my reference, DAZ Studio, and Poser's going to be for me to see what I'm converting over to, obviously. So the first thing in Poser that I would do if I were you is open up the library window, which is over here, and I would add your runtime for DAZ. So for me, my DAZ Studio is program files, and then I've got a separate library called my DAZ library, and I go there, click it, and so long as you see runtime, that's the way to add it to your library. Why should you do that? Because it massively aids finding textures when you render. So you could just have the texture path included, but it's just easier to have the runtime added, and then when you're searching, it will search that library as well. So the first thing I want to do is add a primitive into DAZ Studio. So I'm going to add a sphere. This one is 1 meter in size. And then I'm going to go into, what did I say I was going to do first? I said I was going to do this earth tones one. So basically we have some simple textures with some different types of variations on. So let's just do this one. We're only going to do one just to show you the principle. So I'm going to select the objects in scene window, sphere. Then I'm going to go down and make sure I'm in surfaces. Oops, a daisy. And I'm going to select the surface that I want to apply to. Now, the reason I use the sphere is because it's simple. There's only one surface. Then I'm going to go to my content library, and I'm going to apply with a double click the texture that I want to apply. And there's the texture. And if I give that a super quick render, you'll get an idea. It's kind of a terracotta with a gradient on it. Okay, so how am I going to convert that? Well, the first thing I need to do is to look down at the material and find out which of these nodes have materials actually loaded. So here we can see the base color has this texture. Then there's something here that's a normal map. I'm guessing that gives it just some kind of mattness. Then there's metal flakes. Well, we can't do metal flakes in Poser, so we're not going to be able to recreate that. And that's it. So we've basically got a normal map and we've got a texture map. Oh, was that a bump map? Oh, there's a bump map as well. Okay, so I'm going to click on base color and I'm going to click browse. So you see here it's JClay Text 3. I'm going to click browse and that's going to take me to the folder where the textures are stored. And I'm just going to click here, Control C, and I'm going to copy that path. Okay, I'll just leave that open for now. Then I'm going to go to Poser and I'm also going to add a primitive here. So I'm going to go to here. I'm going to add a ball. And this one's much smaller in Poser, so I'm just going to increase that till, oops, a daisy. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do that until it looks kind of biggish. And you can see this is very low resolution. If I go into hidden line, you can see how few polygons there are. And that's really quite important to understand that because a lot of textures include displacement. So what I need to do is make sure there are enough polygons in my object to be able to do displacement. So the first thing I do is go up to figure, check skinning method, and make sure that it's already set to Poser Unimesh. Then I'm going to go properties and I'm going to increase the preview. In this case, I'm going to go to 3. I could maybe go even to 4 because it's just a simple object, but you'll quickly find more complicated objects, the polygons will get out of control. So now back to texture shaded view. See, I'm just changing ways of viewing the scene here. So texture shaded, and I'm going to go into material. Now, we have 3 types of material root node. We have the PoserSurface, which is the one that's been around since forever. Then we've got new node and we have cycles and we have physical surface. So cycles is the one that's the same as Blender, and physical surface is the same as Substance Designer. So we're going to use the physical surface. Every time I don't use this, Herobito says I should, so I'm going to just do it this way for now. But I'm also going to do a PoserSurface for those of you who are still using Firefly. So physical surface will give me a PBR texture, that's a physically based render texture, which responds to the laws of physics when I render it in Superfly. So this is it's the equivalent of DAZ Studio iRay, and this is equivalent of DAZ Studio, the other one, whatever DAZ Studio's old one used to be called. Goodness me, can't remember what it's called now. But in DAZ Studio they had a biased renderer, and then they went to iRay, which was their physically based renderer, and in Poser they did the same. So physical surface. When I render physical surface, it's going to use Superfly. When I do PoserSurface or Firefly render, it's going to use this node. So the first thing I need to do is to load in or select an image map. Now I'm going to need at least 2 or 3 of these, so I might as well just create here, or I could have just done Control C, Control V and copy and paste, which is possibly quicker. So just put that over there for now. So the first thing I need to do is my color root node. So I'm going to do browse, and I'm going to paste that directory that I chose before, which I copied here. And what was that texture called? That texture was called Clay 03. So Poser Clay 03, it goes there. And I'm just going to drag that into color. And I'm also going to drag that into diffuse color over here. So this is going to give the color when I render with Superfly. Next thing I want to do is add the normal map. So this is now going to select the directory I had before. So which normal map? There's only two normal maps here, so it's obviously just doing a simple texture across all of them. So let's slide down here until we find normal map. So normal map, so JG Clay N. So let's go to Poser, JG Clay N. There's the normal map. Now, here's where things get interesting. In Poser, in the PoserSurface, which you're going to use if you do Firefly, it has a bump node, and it also has a gradient bump. Now, gradient was designed for backwards compatibility way back when bump maps came in the BUM format, which was basically 16-bit bump format, BMP format, but the file extension was changed to BUM. It was bloody silly, to be honest. But it also is the place that you can plug in your normal maps. So if I plug my normal map in there, you can see the normal map here. Now this normal map is purple, blue, and red. And so that means that if I click here, the gradient mode, I'm going to change this. It means it's a tangent space normal map. So I just select that to make sure it behaves properly. I could plug this into the bump channel instead, but what happens is the bump tends to be a bit more pixelated, and then I've got to mess about with the bump value as well. Okay, so what else do we have? We actually did have a bump map, so I'm just going to find that as well. So we've got, I guess this is going to be 2B, but let's have a look. Base bump, JClay B. Okay, so I'm just going to add JClay B here. And now I'm going to wire that into this bump channel. And this is currently set to 0, so I'm going to have to tweak that around until I find a good level. This is set to 0.83, which is usually too high. I usually reduce that for everything down to 0.02 to start with. And for this bump, I'm going to set that to 1 and see where we go with that. So, okay, so at a very basic level, I've now set that up, and I'm going to go to Superfly first. So I'm going to do render settings, Superfly. It's going to be quick to render, so I might as well do a high resolution, a high detail Optix render. And I'm just going to get that to render. Okay, so we can see straight away that in Firefly, that's way too glossy. So why is that glossy? Probably because the roughness is set too low. So in the physical surface node, there's this value here called roughness, and the lower you go, the shinier it gets. The higher you go, the rougher it gets. So there's possibly a roughness map here. Let's have a look. I didn't see it, but there very often is. Okay, I don't know if I'm missing it. Okay, I'm not seeing one. So they've achieved that matte finish in a different way, perhaps. Let me just go through these and see if there's anything there affecting. So there's diffuse roughness here, and the roughness is set to 0. And glossy layered weight is actually high, so I wouldn't expect that if it was meant to be. And the reflectivity is okay. So here, glossy roughness is probably what's doing it. Okay, so I'm just going to have to achieve that by just changing the roughness value. So let's just try that to 1. And okay, so that's immediately lost all shine. So let's go to a value of 0.5. And on Firefly, the roughness is going to be controlled by the specularity here or by a reflection value, but we're not going to have any reflection, so it'll just be specularity, even though there's actually a separate specularity setting here. As you know, specularity is the way it picks up here. See, we've got a light coming in from this side. And I must show you something else as well, but I'll just render that first of all, just to see the difference. So there we go, that's starting to look okay. So maybe I could make that even a little bit matter, but here's something that you need to know. When you're using DAZ as your reference, DAZ has a thing called a headlamp. And a headlamp, if I just render this again, a headlamp is a light that it uses when no other lights have been added to the scene. And you can see here, it makes the objects look much brighter from the very start. As soon as you start adding lights, then the headlamp switches off. But if you're looking to try and compare your texture to that, your default lights in Poser are not going to be nearly bright enough. So what I suggest you do is get rid of these defaults. So we'll go to Scripts, Utility, and then just do Delete Lights. That'll get rid of all 4 of those lights. Back to the preview, and now I'm just going to add 2 spotlights. Why do I use spotlights? And I'm sounding like a lawyer again. I've been watching too much Glenn Kirshner. He's an online lawyer, and because he's a lawyer, they always say, why do we do this as a way to pose questions? So here's my spotlight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do point at, so it points at the ball, and then I go up, and I'm going to move it over here to the right. What I want to do is create a high degree of directional specularity. So here's a shadow. So I think I'm going to move that back further to make it softer. And I'm going to go higher. So why do I want to use a spotlight? Because the spotlight gives nice specularity. So if I render that now, okay, not showing up too much at the moment. Maybe I could turn that value of that spotlight up. 300 intensity. Okay, so I need to turn the roughness down now because it's so smooth, it's so rough that the rougher the surface, the less specularity it shows. So I'm going to turn that down to 0.3. And I saw straight away, see some specularity showing here on the small preview. Okay, so this is a situation where I could carry on tweaking this, and in fact I'm going to drag that over there. So what I'm looking for is a nice specular highlight here, but the roughness is actually, the roughness map is killing it, or it could be the bump or normal map actually. Let me just show you something. If I go to here and disconnect that bump map. Oh, actually, did I have? Well, let's render it without that, and hopefully it should show you. So immediately the specularity comes in with the bump map out. So the bump map is contributing to the lack of specular. So what I'm going to do, I think I actually had a bump map plugged into bump, and I didn't plug the normal map in. So I'm going to plug the normal map in, value of 1. So let's just have a look at that. So the specular is still showing now. And I think we're going to add a fill light over here. So a fill light is a second spotlight, which just kind of stops it having such deep shadows. So I'm going to point at the ball again, and I'm going to move that up and to the sides, and I'm watching the shadow to see where it's positioned, and I'm going to move it back a little bit. Okay, so this one doesn't need to be so bright, so I could maybe do 50%. And Control R to render, and this is hopefully going to get rid of that dark shadow there. And again, the lighting is not so important. Well, the lighting is actually incredibly important, but that's not the point of today's tutorial. So you can see here now we've got 2 specular points. Here's one specular from the light on the left, the fill light, and here's a specular from the main light on the right. if I was desperate to get it to match that, I mean, this appears to have only one specular light and maybe an area light, which is going to give a much softer shadow. I could try and attempt to do that, but I'm not really going to bother too much, I think. Right, so here's our first way of creating a texture. It's fairly simple, and if I now change to Firefly, it will use the other renderer. So I'm going to do that on a fairly lowish render quality. So it's going to cast shadows, not going to do too many. Oh no, we at least want it to do ray tracing. Okay. So as I move up through the levels here, it adds these properties to it. So now this is the lowest level, it's going to add ray tracing. I don't care about lots of ray tracing bounces because there's not a lot to bounce it off. Maybe we could get bounces off the floor, but it's only a preview. So let's just give that a render. And there you go. That's we know that the Firefly version's working fine. And when I go up here, you can see when it renders Firefly, that renders that version that I did there. And when it renders Superfly, it does that version. Now, I'm going to leave all of this wired up because I'm going to cheat on the next material. So I said that we were going to do 3 difficulties. So the next difficulty is going to be this leather thing here. And if I go into DAZ and I add that shader, so we've got a leather shader here, and let's do right. So this artist has very kindly provided 1 and 2K texture maps. So that's the number of 1,000 pixels. So 2,000 pixels for the texture map, which is a good level. You know, it's a fairly high resolution. Why would you include 2? Because the lower resolution is fine for distant scenes, so you don't need the memory taken up with a large texture map. But when you start getting close, like we are here, you maybe want something a little bit higher resolution. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got my sphere default material selected, and now I'm going to add that leather, and let's give that a quick render. Okay, so that's quite gnarly looking. It's quite pleasant. Now let's recreate that in Poser. So do you remember how we do that? The first thing that we need to do is find out what elements are in it. So there's a base color. So let's just grab the path from here. So here's the base color, PBR leather shaders for iRay. And that's ready to plug into our other thing. So we've got a base color. We've got glossy roughness. Remember I said I think there'll be one of those to control the specularity in the other one, but there wasn't. This was what I was expecting. So there's a glossy roughness plugged in. There's a normal map. There's no bump map this time. I was kind of surprised there was a bump in the last one, given the fact there was also a normal map. There's a displacement map. So that's what's making this, in theory, this texture is actually sticking out here. It's not very obvious. This is really smooth here, but who knows? In fact, let's have a look at the displacement. No, he's definitely using it. Okay, it's just not very obvious. Okay, so we've got 4 maps there, I believe I said. So let's go to here. Let's add another one. So let's do new node 2D textures image map. So let's do our color map first of all. Browse. Plug that path in that we just did. So which leather was that? So that was base color leather A brown 4K. So I've gone with 4K because we're working close. So leather brown 4K. Okay, I didn't actually see a 4K option, but I guess it must have been there. I wouldn't be here now, right? So there's a 4K leather. Now sometimes you can have a high resolution texture to give the visual detail, but the bump map or the normal map can be lower resolution. So here, no, that's 4K as well. Leather A 4K rough. So we've got I'm going to plug that pathway in again. Leather A 4K. Okay, so he's actually named them nicely here. Look, leather A 2K, leather A 4K. So we've got three control maps, if you like, and one color map. So we'll do displacement for. Oh, actually, that's already plugged in. No, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to do the normal map. Leather A 4K normal map. So the reason I've done that is because it's already plugged in. So it's silly to do something I'm going to have to do again. So this is going to be our displacement map. So I'm going to plug that into the displacement channel here and into the displacement channel over here. And then I'm going to find my displacement map. So this is going to go to the previously used path. And I'm going to choose leather A 4K displacement. This looks like a lot. I'm going to take this down to 0.2 for the Firefly. And there's nothing here, so I'm going to go up to 0.2 here. I don't know if this uses the same scale as this. I suspect it doesn't, but we'll find out in a second. And the last thing to do is the bump map, is that? Let's have a look. Leather A4, roughness map. Okay, so there's no bump map for this one. So I'm going to go into here. This is a roughness map. I'm going to unplug from the bump. This roughness map is then going to go into here. And again, we're going to have to suck it and see on the value here. To be honest, if I was more professional, I would have tested this first to see how this glossy roughness value here of 1 compares what that scale is to here. So if I put 1 in here, which on the other one presumably is 100%, does this mean 100% here or not? I'm not quite sure. You know, are the two scales directly comparable? And I often, when I'm doing Firefly, I take this into specular instead, and so that's a specular value. So let's give that a test render first of all in Superfly. Okay, so immediately I can see the displacement's way too heavy, but everything else, the colour's looking okay, the specular's looking fine. So let's have a look at our displacement value. 0.2. Okay, so 0.02, for example. Assuming it's actually the same scale as this over here. Okay, I'm going to zoom in so we can see the effect a lot nicer. This displacement is why I increased the... Okay, that's pretty much their first time, isn't it? Let's have a look. Yep. You know, I mean, notwithstanding lighting, we've kind of nailed that one, haven't we? So you could do any of that. So the only way that was a bit more difficult was that we had a displacement map and a roughness map. Let's just have a look to see how that looks in Firefly. It would be too much luck for it to work well in both first time, but let's try it anyway. See these little squares as it... Oh, there you go. Spot on. Wow, I'm smarter than I realised. See those little squares? They're what's known as buckets, or numbers of pixels that it renders at a time. And in the render settings, in Firefly, if I go to manual settings, acquire from auto, you can see all the settings that were set in that automatic thing, but you can granularly, if that's a word, adjust them all. And you see here, maximum bucket size is how large a square, how many pixels, 32 by 32, it renders at a time. So on modern graphics cards, if you've got a 30 series, for example, NVIDIA, you can easily increase that to 512. And what you should see is much larger squares, which means it renders quicker. There you go. And the same is also true on Superfly, and the bucket size here 128. they set it low for safety on their setting, but I can go up to 1,000 here, and well, I'll show you why not. And it'll quite happily render a bucket size of 1,000. There you go, 1,000's the whole area. It's doing the whole thing at once. See how quick that is. So you have to play around with the bucket size and tweak it a little bit, see how that works. Now, I'm just going to show you something else. So we've created a material that we like. Let's go to our materials, and I've got a tutorial here, and I'm going to do save. Now, I can save a single material, which is what I've created here. So I could just apply that to a part of a model or a single material within a model. And I'm just going to call that leather. There you go. Or if it was a collection, supposing this had, like, you know, it's a car and it had a paint job and it had chrome and all of that, I could save the entire collection there. But for now, single material. And I'm going to turn off selected nodes only. I'll show you why in a second. By default, that's off anyway. And I'm just going to do save. And that saved that there. I would then manually render a preview for that. And then I can reapply that in future. That's going to come into it in a second. So, okay, so it's now tomorrow. I wasn't happy with the final section that I recorded, so I'm re-recording it today, which is why a lot of the stuff will look a little bit different. So the final section we're looking at is this embossed metal texture, and it's an interesting one. It has two components. It has the embossing and it has the metal color. So the embossing is applied via a normal map or a bump map. So let's just add an emboss there, and you can see it's applied that pattern to it. If I quickly render that, you'll see it doesn't change the color except for shadows. It just adds that nice emboss. And then we can add a metal color. So we'll just go with a simple kind of rust texture, number 1. Apply that and render that again. And as you can see, that's quite a nice effect there. So the clever thing here is that you can apply these two elements separately. So let's just go to here. We'll do currently used to see what elements are in the texture, and let's pick up the path to the texture. So here he's got a separate directory for metals and embossing by the look of it. And let's go over to Poser. So this is probably wired differently to how it was wired last night when I went to bed. Probably shouldn't record videos at 3 in the morning, but anyway. So let's put in, first of all, let's put in our color texture path. So there's the first one. Now what we're looking for is the bump map or the normal map. So it was a normal map, wasn't it? So let's do let's just see what elements are in here. Yeah, so we've got normal maps and bump maps, but I don't think that these are actually used. I think these are for the glossy layered height or something. So it's just normal maps I've got to worry about. Basically, with the other maps, when we wanted to save them to our library, it was easy because we saved the entire map to the library. So we saved everything shown here as a single shader. But with this one, it could be useful to save the color component separately from the bump component. So we recreate what they have here, where we've got a library of colors and a library of embossing bump maps. And you can kind of do that in Poser. I don't know fully how to do it. Maybe Poser doesn't enable you to do it without Python scripting, which I don't know. But what we can do is we can save here. So we go into our materials room and we click plus to save. But before we do it, we decide what we're going to save. So I guess you'd say there's 3 components to this. There's the color, which is attached to a surface node, root node, and there are 2 different root nodes, and then there's the bump. So it makes sense to save the bump separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these 4 nodes here. Then when I go into here and do plus, so now I've got the choice here. So we'll call this green. And here's the important bit, selected nodes only is highlighted. So by default, that's turned off. I highlight that. And now when I say that, that creates this green thing here, which will only add these textures. Now, the really important thing here is that if you save a single node, as we're about to, right, so I'll demonstrate. So I'll go to the normal map, and I'm going to do the same as I just did. So we'll just call that normal, and single material selected node only. When I add that to the scene, I have two options down here. We have add to scene and we have replace in scene. So if I double click on this normal, it will replace everything there. Let me just demonstrate. So I double click or select a single tick here. So I'm just going to double click. And you'll notice immediately in the preview that's gone white because it's deleted all of those nodes and then automatically created a PoserSurface root node. It's because every material has to have at least one root node by default. So I'll undo that. However, if I now do, oops, days, oh, flipping heck. If I add to my scene using this option, it adds it to the scene, but it doesn't replace what's already there. So I'll demonstrate that. And hopefully that normal map, there you go. So there's a duplicate of that node now. So what I don't want is that when I add this to the scene, it also replaces these nodes. So I could have saved that like that, but then that would have replaced the color, and I may have a color that I already wanted. So this is one of those situations where you have to have a workflow when you create your material. So the workflow would be color first, embossing second, and here's here's how we do it. So if I do click to add to scene with the green color, see, it deletes that node. It replaces all of the nodes that are there. And even if I just do add to scene, it will just give me a duplicate of this on top. Now, if I do the normal and do add to scene, that comes in here. And as you see, it doesn't come in wired in, which is mildly annoying. There's probably a way of doing it. I don't know what it is. As I say, probably involves Python scripting or something. And then I just wire that back in. That's easy enough. And there you go. So that's just a way to create a library with different elements of your texture separately. So it's not more difficult, particularly. It's just a slightly more sophisticated way of creating your texture. And then hopefully when I render that, that looks pretty good, as you can see. And I could spend more time working out how to make that shiny. I'm not going to bother.